Hi, well here I am outside my house on my doorstep on Danes Way. I wonder if you've been spending time outside your homes recently, at your doors, maybe clapping the NHS or speaking to neighbours, walking past. But as I've been standing here and thinking, I've realised that this is Holy Week. We're coming up to Easter and the time that the Jews celebrated the Passover. And of course they were told to come and smear the blood of a lamb on their doorposts, all round the wooden lintel across the top, the horizontal one, and down the doorpost on the side. Now we're not going to do that this Easter, but we have painted a cross on our window along with two rainbows, saying that Jesus is the hope of the world, and a message saying Happy Easter to those that walk past our home, because we want them to know that we're Christians and that we want to celebrate Easter, and we want them to celebrate as well the life they could know in our Saviour Jesus. Just like the Passover lamb's blood was put on the upright and the horizontal beam of the door, so Jesus spilled his blood on the cross, again the horizontal and the vertical wooden beams, to pour out his life for us. So we've put that sign on our house. We also just found this great resource online. It's a rainbow with the empty tomb there and a cross, and it says Easter means hope. That's actually a website address, eastermeanshope.com, where you can print off this and maybe colour it in to mark out your home this Easter. Not because you're wanting to experience the Passover in that way. We're not trying to mark our homes out so that God will pass over us as the first Israelites did. But we do want to mark ourselves out as Christians. We want people to know that we believe in the hope of Jesus, and we want people to have conversations with us. In fact, the day that Gemma and the kids painted our windows with the cross and the rainbows, that same day our neighbour came and spoke about how they'd watched a service the previous day through an online streaming service they'd seen, and that opened a conversation and a way forward in that relationship. So I'd encourage you to put something in your homes to mark you out. And let's think a bit more about how the Jews marked out that first Passover day. If you look at the story of the Passover in Exodus chapters 11 to 13, you see that God had a very specific plan for his people, a very specific way he was going to rescue them, and a specific way he wanted them to respond to him as well. We've already said that he told them to take in a one-year-old lamb into their homes without defect, and then to sacrifice that lamb and put the blood on the doorposts of their homes to mark them out as his people. That was actually quite an offensive thing to do. Remember, they're living in Egypt, and at the time there were many gods that the Egyptian worshipped, but actually one of them was represented by a male ram. And so for them to sacrifice a ram was seen as highly offensive in their culture. In fact, Moses is worried that the people could be stoned to death for doing such a sacrifice, which you read about in chapter 8 and verse 26. So this was deliberately countercultural for the people of Egypt. But for the Hebrews, for the Jewish people, this wasn't so offensive. In fact, as children of Abraham, they were well aware of the story of Abraham going up the mountain to sacrifice his son Isaac, and God providing a ram so that Isaac would be saved. So this was a picture and an image they were familiar with. They knew that their God loved to save, and that using a ram was a significant way to do that. Spilling the blood of a lamb instead of their own blood. I wonder if any of you have started making your own bread recently, as the shelves in the supermarkets haven't been as well stocked as normal. Yesterday we went out and bought some bread flour to try out our bread maker for the first time. And I said, oh, we need to get some yeast as well. And then Gemma looked and found that actually the bread flour available already had the yeast mixed in. And actually something else that Israelite people were told to do at Passover was to make bread without yeast. And again, in the culture of Egypt, that would have been striking, a really radical thing to do. I don't know if you're aware of where yeast was first pioneered and used in baking and in fermenting beer. It was actually in ancient Egypt. This was an Egyptian practice. Yeast was first recorded as being used in their culture. You can even look up on Wikipedia to see that yeast traces its origins back to ancient Egypt. It was a distinctively Egyptian product and commodity. And so when the Israelites are told to make bread without yeast, this is a symbol of something far more significant than we might first think. Yes, it was because they were in a rush to leave Egypt, but actually it was also a sign that more than just leaving Egypt and God wanting them to be free from the land of Egypt and come out of Egypt, God actually wanted to make sure Egypt was taken out of them, that they would be separate from their culture that they'd grown up in and know him as God and be marked out as his people. Even Paul talks about yeast in his letter to the Corinthians. In chapter 5 and verses 6 to 8 we read this: "Don't you know that a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast, that you may be a new batch, without yeast, as you really are. For Christ our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. Therefore let us keep the festival not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and wickedness, but with bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth." Paul knows that we are meant to be people that are marked out for Jesus, marked out because of his sacrifice for us. And yet we're not meant to be people that know him in isolation. God died on the cross to save a whole community. He's interested in the whole community. He wants to save people that will honour him, a community together. And we see that in some of the other instructions that the Israelites receive at the first Passover. They're told that if they have only a few people in their homes, that to sacrifice a lamb for just one or two people would be too much. They'd have too much meat. And so to actually go to their nearest neighbours and invite them to join them in sharing this meal, because God's salvation was for the whole community. That is the same for us today. The cross of Easter, Jesus dying on the cross, was once for all. And we want to invite people to know salvation through him. So I don't know how you're going to do that this Easter. I don't know whether you're going to do that through painting a cross along with your rainbows in your window to say, look, Jesus is the hope this world needs. He died for you and for me. Are you going to mark your home out like that? Are you going to colour in one of those sheets I've mentioned? Or are you going to stand and talk to your neighbours about this Easter when you see them? Something else you can do will be publicised through Church Suite later, a really practical way of helping those in need in our community. Because Jesus' disciples are also marked out, not just by knowing him, but by loving one another. That's how Jesus said people would see that we're his disciples. So I would encourage you to, when you get notification through Church Suite of a way you can help in this community in this time, to step out and help and take your part. But also just be thinking about Jesus this weekend and reaching out to your neighbours. Again, there's a service on Sunday. You might want to invite your friends who maybe you've never felt able to invite to church before, to find the playlist on YouTube and watch along. Of course, the final thing we see in the Passover as well is that the people who had celebrated this Passover meal were told to do it ready, dressed, ready to go on a journey. And we know that they were about to leave Egypt physically. But for us, we should also be ready. The salvation that comes to us through Jesus on the cross isn't the end of our salvation, but the beginning of a journey. I pray that you will walk with Jesus this week, through this Easter weekend and in the weeks ahead, on that journey with him. Why don't you take time to make yourself ready for that? There's also some material I'm putting online on Friday for you to go through and pause and reflect on the story of Good Friday and what Jesus has done for us. So I pray you take advantage of those things as well, and let's enjoy that journey together as God's community.